If you haven't noticed, I'm a big fan of Type Moon and their most prominent series, the Fate series. That being said, if you asked me what my favorite Type Moon game was, you would not get the typical Fate Stay Night or Tsukihime. Instead, my response to you is what we have for review today, Fate Hollow Ataraxia. Fate Hollow Ataraxia is a sequel set half a year later after all of the endings in Fate Stay Night. How exactly does that work, you may ask? A magical accident goes horribly wrong, messing with time and space, causing everyone who died in the 5th Holy Grail War to come back to life, with the 5th Holy Grail War starting up again. To me, that sounded like a huge excuse to continue the plot, and if there's an excuse to continue a story that's more BS than that, I'd like to hear it, just to prove how absurd this is. In an interview with the writer, Nasu said, "It's best if you don't think too much about it." Bizet Frege McRemets, a member of the Mages Association and a master in the 5th Holy Grail War, wakes up on the 4th day of the 5th Holy Grail War with a new servant Avenger and no memory of what happened to her beforehand. She and Avenger set off to fight and win the Holy Grail. Meanwhile, Shiro Emiya lives a peaceful life with all his friends from the 5th Holy Grail War. The servants, however, sense a new danger while dark creatures soon appear afterward. Shiro sets off to ensure nobody is in danger, and finds himself frequently meeting with the mysterious girl, Karen Hortenza. Both Bizet and Shiro find themselves in a time loop that lasts 4 days, beginning on the 4th day of the 5th Holy Grail War. Each time they die or survive 4 days, they always awake on the first day of the loop, aware of what's happened to them since the first loop began. Determined to end this loop, Bizet, Avenger, and Shiro fight to discover the truth behind what's causing these endless 4 days. While the premise of the story may seem quite generic given the whole Groundhog Day plot, that's not really the point. It may not have the large scope like the other stories in the Fate series, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because it leads to a more focused narrative. What makes Fate Hollow Ataraxia special is not the premise, but the execution. Almost everything about this story is executed very well, with the only exception being the ending. While enjoyable, it's anticlimactic and it uses a Deus Ex Machina to wrap up the story, which is extremely frustrating given how great the rest of the story is. The more serious elements of the story are done extremely well with no major writing issues. It has stellar pacing and intense writing that keeps you interested, and a fantastic atmosphere. This atmosphere is what pushes this from great to amazing in my eyes. It's an atmosphere that absorbs you and engages you with the story and makes you crave more. It's one that makes you feel like you are a part of this world and the conflict that is going on, and it attaches you to the story. This atmosphere is very apparent in Bizet's segments, where they utilized it to balance the mystery and tension beautifully. Also, like every Type Moon work, Fate Hollow Ataraxia has interesting themes and ideals floating around, and the way that it executes this theme of falseness is intriguing, interesting, and well integrated into the story. It's little things like this that help games like Fate Hollow Ataraxia, and it's these little things that make games interesting and memorable. That being said, Fate Hollow Ataraxia is a much more lighthearted story than any of Type Moon's other games. The tone is like a mixture between Fate Stay Night and Carnival Phantasm. It has the seriousness of Fate Stay Night at times, but also the exaggerated silliness of Carnival Phantasm at other times. The best part? It manages to excel at both. It doesn't just shaft either tone. Instead, it prioritizes them as equally as they possibly can, and seeing this balance is something I love. If you're coming from Fate Zero's cold seriousness, this might be a turnoff, but if you're like me and enjoy the humor of Carnival Phantasm, you will love this. Fate Hollow Ataraxia is enjoyable to me because it's a compilation of everything I enjoy about Type Moon works. Great writing, hilarious comedy, and intriguing themes that make these works entertaining throughout. No matter what tone Fate Hollow Ataraxia utilizes, it excels at creating excellent scenes that are interesting and enjoyable. It has a high quality of writing that is consistent throughout, with almost every scene helping to develop characters or just be flat out enjoyable to the reader. These scenes, which range from simple things like eating food to epic fights, are something that help make the story great and help the enjoyment of the game. Even though a good majority of these characters already have a great deal of development due to Fate Stay Night being way longer than it really needed to, the extra development is appreciated, and the development with new characters like Karen and Avenger were absolutely great. I could go on and on about how great the writing is in Fate Hall Ataraxia and how well it does every little thing, but I'll spare you the gushing. It's like a compilation of everything great about Type Moon stories to me, and it's a story I can't help but enjoy. It's well written, very enjoyable, and it does very little wrong. Due to Fate Hall Ataraxia's interesting means of plot progression, it creates an interesting means of gameplay. It creates a semi-linear story, with the main plot being broken up into chapters and told in a straight line, but for all the side stories it's very open. You can do most of the events in any order you feel like. You switch between the perspectives of Bizet and Shiro. At the beginning of each chapter you have the kinetic-like Bizet segments, then you play with Shiro for the rest of it. When you are playing as Shiro, it's 4 days, with each day being broken up into 4 segments: morning, noon, afternoon, and night, in which you see one event. Each character represents an event, and when there's an event you haven't seen, there's either a new or an exclamation point that pops up. All exclamation point events are for the story, while new ones are just things on the side. The big kicker to the gameplay though? Saves act as quick saves, so you can't make a ton of them, and you have to continue where you were at. This system of gameplay gives you a lot of control at the pace you want to go at. You can fool around with all the slice of life side stories and have a slower slice of life pacing, or you can go straight to the important stories and have a very tight, almost thriller-esque story. I did the mix of the two depending on my mood, and I love the absolute control you have when it comes to pace. It's almost like a book in that aspect. This makes you feel more like you are actually progressing through the plot with Shiro, and accompanied by the ability to change the pace, makes for a game that is a change of pace for visual novels. I love this aspect of it, and it made for an engaging experience that you typically don't see in visual novels. If you haven't noticed, this game is pretty. Well, a good majority of the art is just carryovers from Fate Stay Night. All the new stuff is amazing, and there's quite a bit of it. This is really the first truly modern Type Moon work in my eyes, and it has some absolutely beautiful CG. Even though it's only a year after Fate Stay Night, it's aged so much better. It's so polished, beautiful, and detailed. It's a game with style, and it uses this style to get over technical feats. I also really appreciate all the visual effects this game has, like the simple omake-esque art, to the more advanced things like bokeh, and it really spices up the visuals into something special. Even better than that though is just the amazing fight scenes. While it's a visual novel, they have so much art and the motion is so fluid. It's like watching an anime. The archer fight with Saber was just brilliant. It's fantastic and I love it. Also, just like its predecessor, this is an eroge, so cue the obligatory eroge warning here. That being said, most of the H scenes are completely optional, which is nice, but there's one at the end of the game which you'll have to get through to finish the story, so be aware of that. Icing on the cake. That's what this soundtrack really is. It's wonderful. Personally, I was not a big fan of Fate Stay Night soundtrack, so stepping into Fate Hall Ataraxia's was something that blew my mind. Fate Hall Ataraxia has variety, extremely memorable tracks, and is just composed well. There's some really stellar stuff here, and almost always you'll be listening to something that's pleasing to your ear. This soundtrack does it all. Great usage, sets up an atmosphere extremely well, is great to listen outside the game, and it manages to blow your mind. One thing to note though is that there is no voice acting like Fate Stay Night, which sucks, but considering how great the soundtrack is, that's not really a big deal. My issue with so many of Type Moon's stuff is that a good majority of them just have one huge flaw. Tsukihime has its low production values, Kara no Kyoka has its extremely high barrier of entry, Fate Stay Night is way too long for its own good, and Fate Zero is kinda just really boring because of its characters. Fate Hall Ataraxia to me has none of this. unlike the others, this game is constantly trying to entertain you, and I was entertained. Fate Hollow Ataraxia is probably the most fun I've ever had playing a visual novel. Totally serious here. I originally played this on the 3.1 translation, and only got about 40% through the game because the translation wasn't anywhere close to done and I just didn't know enough Japanese. Even though I never got close to finishing it on that run, I loved the hell out of it, and I called it my favorite Type Moon work at that point with only 40% done. And when I went to play through it again, I loved it just as much. Replaying it did not hinder my experience at all. That's just how enjoyable this game is. The list of great things about Fate Hollow Ataraxia can go on and on. The references from Fate Zero and Fate Stay Night were entertaining, the world building was outstanding, the balance of the story was great, the game has a great sense of humor, and just overall, I love Fate Hollow Ataraxia, and it was a blast to play through. If you haven't gotten the message yet, I love Fate Hollow Ataraxia. How can a small fan-disc sequel be better than the original game that spawned a huge series that's adored by tons of fans? Simple. By being much more entertaining, improving upon its predecessor in every way, and having a charm that a few games can match. It's a great game, and I hope you love it just as much as I did. This has been Rockmandash Reviews, signing out.